Hello everyone, bringing you a video today which is part 2 in a pair of videos looking at US and Australian forces early during the Vietnam War during Operation Hump, which was a joint US-Australian search and destroy mission launched roughly 17 miles to the north of Bien Hoa near the Dong Nai River. The forces deployed were US troops of the 173rd Airborne Brigade and men of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, which had been attached to the brigade when 1RAR arrived in Vietnam earlier in 1965. We looked at a recreation of Australian troops in part 1. We're going to be looking at a recreation of US troops in part 2. Originally this was going to be a one-part video comparing the two. Unfortunately, some of the kit needed for the US recreation hadn't arrived in time, so I've had to make this as a two-part video. In contrast to the Australian forces, who were deployed to the south of the Dong Nai River, US forces were inserted via a landing zone to the northwest of the river. The ensuing battle would become somewhat infamous, primarily in US terms due to the heavy casualties sustained, and as said in part 1, Australian forces had to leave 2 men on the battlefield missing, presumed dead. Quite famously, Lawrence Joel, a medic of the 1st Battalion of the 503rd, one of the infantry battalions of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, would receive the Medal of Honour due to his conspicuous gallantry in saving life during the operation. And what we're going to look at now is a recreation of an infantryman of the 173rd Airborne Brigade during the operation. Looking at the recreation here, we can see that men of the 173rd Airborne Brigade around this time, certainly infantrymen, showed the most up-to-date US kit designed for use in tropical environments. This includes the tropical combat uniform, tropical combat boots, and of course we'll run over this in more detail as we look at the uniform and equipment that's worn here. The weapon carried is the XM16E1. Of course, many US troops in Vietnam at this time would still be using the M14, but elite units such as the 173rd and other airborne units had been provided with the XM16E1. Looking at the uniform, we'll start at the top, and in contrast to the Australian recreation we looked at previously in part 1, a helmet is worn. Australians didn't make much use of helmets in Vietnam. They did wear them occasionally, whereas they were far more common amongst US troops. The M1, or in this case the M1C, of course, the 173rd being an airborne unit, the M1C is worn, and this is the airborne modified version of the M1 with various extra fittings to allow it to be used as a jump helmet. This includes a different type of chin strap and so forth, though some features are not evident here, with the additional chin strap for the liner being tucked out of the way. The basic uniform consists of the first pattern tropical combat uniform with the exposed buttons, epaulettes and adjustment tabs, which make the first pattern very visually distinct from the later patterns of tropical combat uniform. Of course, not universal issue in Vietnam at this time. Many line units in particular were still wearing the old OG fatigue uniform, which is more similar to the Australian uniform we looked at previously, basically being a 2-pocket shirt and simple trousers. But the tropical combat uniform is certainly a great advance on this, and that is what we have here. At this time period, worn with full colour insignia, as you can see. On the wearer's right, we have the name tape, printed in black on white webbing, and on the wearer's left, the US Army tape, and above this, the basic parachutist badge. You can also see an interesting feature of the tropical combat uniform here, in that the chest pockets have a small slot allowing them to be used as a pen pocket, and you can see a red Bic ballpoint is being carried here alongside a US government issue pen. And on the left arm, the brigade patch is worn with the airborne tab above, again both in full colour. The load carrying equipment is of course M1956, and you can see at the front here the ammunition cases. These are of first issue pattern with the grommet or eyelet in the quick release tab. Second issue were also around at this time as well, so you could equally have seen those. And as you can see, these are being used to carry a couple of M26 grenades on the side. We would note that the straps are looped through the grenade ring, which is the way these are supposed to be carried to try and avoid the pin being pulled out accidentally on vegetation and so forth. On the wearer's left-hand pouch, the compass first aid pouch has been clipped onto the side, as you can see here, and this is a second issue example. On each hip, a canteen is carried, and by this point we have the plastic canteens. Earlier in 1965, it was very common still to see the metal M1910 canteens. By this point, plastic are the most common to see in photographs, and we have a pair of these carried on the hips here in standard M1956 canteen carriers. Looking at the rear of the equipment, we can see here the M1961 field pack or butt pack in US service, and this is an enlarged version compared to the M1956 which we saw in the previous recreation of Australian troops at this time in part 1. It gives a little bit of extra carrying capacity, and it also has a waterproof liner in the throat as well, so it's slightly larger and has that additional feature compared to the original M1956 design. Footwear consists of a pair of second pattern tropical combat boots. These are very similar to the first pattern, but the leather backstay and the leather band around the top of the boot have been replaced with nylon. These had entered production at some point in 1964, and although many troops in Vietnam at this time were still using full leather combat boots, certainly more elite units such as the 173rd were receiving tropical combat boots in greater numbers to replace the standard full leather combat boot. You'll note that in contrast to later patterns, these lack the reinforcing piece over the ankle, which would appear on the third pattern, and these of course are still manufactured with the Vibram sole. So there we are, that's a look at this recreation. Quite a stark contrast to the Australian kit, which is more antiquated, apart from the web equipment, which of course is very similar. In Australia had contracted for US equipment. The US combat uniform is very up to date, very modern for the mid-1960s, as are the tropical combat boots, obviously a very good design which would last for many years after Vietnam. So a soldier equipped in what is very much the United States' most up-to-date tropical uniform for this time period. So there we are, I hope you found it interesting. The idea of this, of course, is partly to compare and contrast the kit worn by Australian and US infantry at this time period operating together in Vietnam, but also to commemorate the operation, the anniversary of the operation. Certainly part 1 was uploaded on the anniversary of the operation itself. I hope you found it interesting looking at this. If you have and you'd like to see more from the channel, then please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, little notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you'd like to support the channel, you can. There's both Patreon and PayPal linked down below. And a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those methods. It's really appreciated, as I always say. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. There's Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, all linked down below. And if you want to get in contact with me but you don't really use social media, there's of course an email address down there as well. But that's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.